Marcus Thompson stood at Gate B7 of the New Earth spaceport, his dark eyes wide with wonder as he watched the massive starship through the crystal-clear windows. The vessel gleamed under the morning sun, its silver hull decorated with the blue and gold stripes of galactic transit lines. At 12 years old, this would be his first trip beyond Earth's atmosphere, and he could barely contain his excitement. "Remember to keep your documentation ready," his mother said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Dr. Lisa Thompson checked their tickets on her tablet one more time, though she had already done so 3 times before leaving home. Everything was in order it had to be, given her position at the Xenobiology Research Institute. The boarding call came right on schedule. Marcus clutched his small backpack, filled with books about spacecraft engineering and star charts he had studied for months in preparation for this journey. As they joined the line, he noticed they were among the few humans traveling today. Most passengers were from various alien species: tall, elegant Centaurians with their shimmering scales, bulky Proximans with their protective environmental suits, and even a family of translucent Europans. When they reached the front of the line, a flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp blue uniform looked up from her screen. Her name tag read Jane Reed. Her smile faltered slightly as her eyes moved from Marcus to his mother and back. "Ticket and documentation, please," she said, her voice notably cooler than it had been with the previous passengers. Dr. Thompson handed over their credentials. Marcus watched as Reed scanned them, her fingers tapping rapidly on her screen. Her forehead wrinkled, and she frowned. "I'm showing a system error with the young man's ticket," Reed announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Dr. Thompson's eyebrows rose. "That's impossible. I double-checked everything this morning. Could you please tell me what the error is?" "It's a technical issue," Reed replied vaguely, avoiding eye contact. "Unfortunately, we can't allow boarding when there are any discrepancies. It's a security protocol." Marcus felt his heart sink. He had spent months looking forward to this trip, studying everything he could about space travel. "But Mom, you said everything was okay," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "It is okay, sweetie." Dr. Thompson turned back to Reed. "I'm a senior researcher at the XRI, and these tickets were issued through our official travel office. Could you please double-check?" Reed's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I've already explained the situation. If you continue to argue, I'll have to call security. Please step aside and let other passengers board." Just then, a Proximan family approached with similar documentation. Marcus watched as Reed processed their tickets without hesitation, despite their boarding passes displaying the same authorization codes as his. "Excuse me," Dr. Thompson said firmly, "but those passengers have the exact same type of documentation we do. I can see their authorization codes from here." Reed's face flushed red. "That's different. Their documentation follows different protocols. Now, I've asked you politely to step aside. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Several passengers looked away uncomfortably. A young Centaurian child caught Marcus's eye and quickly looked down. No one spoke up. "Mom?" Marcus's voice trembled slightly. "Maybe we should go." Dr. Thompson stood still for a moment, her jaw tight. Then she took a deep breath and squeezed Marcus's shoulder. "This isn't over," she said quietly to Reed. "Come on, Marcus. We're leaving, but we're not giving up." As they walked away from the gate, Marcus heard the boarding process continue behind them. He blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. He wouldn't cry. Instead, he pulled out his tablet and began typing notes about what had happened: times, names, details. His mother had always taught him that documentation was important. "I'm sorry, sweetie," Dr. Thompson said, as they reached the spaceport's main concourse. "But I promise you, we're going to handle this the right way." Marcus nodded, still typing. "I know, Mom. And maybe next time, I'll know even more about spaceships." He managed a small smile, though his disappointment felt like a heavy weight in his chest. What neither of them knew then was that this wasn't the end of their story with Flight 2184. In fact, it was just the beginning, and those carefully typed notes would prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. While Marcus and his mother made their way to the spaceport's complaint office, something interesting was happening aboard Flight 2184. In the ship's control room, a small light began blinking on the main computer screen. The ship's AI system, known as Aria, had detected an unusual pattern. Captain Miller, Aria's calm voice announced, "I've found some inconsistencies in today's boarding records." The captain, a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes, looked up from his pre-flight checks. "Show me," he said, pressing a button to display the data on his screen. Numbers and records filled the display. Aria highlighted several entries in red. In the past hour, Flight Attendant Reed has reported 7 system errors with passenger documentation. 6 of these passengers were allowed to board after secondary checks. Only one group was denied boarding, a human mother and child. Captain Miller frowned. He had been flying ships for 20 years and knew that such patterns were rarely accidents. "Show me the security footage from the boarding area," he ordered. The screen split to show multiple camera angles of the boarding process. The captain watched carefully as the scenes played out. His frown deepened as he saw Reed's different treatment of various passengers. Meanwhile, in the complaint office, Dr. Thompson was speaking with Mr. Roberts, the head of passenger services. "Please pull up the records for Flight 2184, she requested. "I want to know exactly what error was flagged on my son's ticket." Mr. Roberts typed quickly on his computer. After a few moments, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Dr. Thompson, according to our system, there were no errors with your documentation. Everything was perfectly in order." Marcus, who had been quietly reading a book about spaceship engines, looked up. "But the flight attendant said there was a problem," he said. "That's right," Mr. Roberts replied, looking troubled. "And that's what makes this situation very serious. False reporting of security issues is against both company policy and galactic travel laws." Just then, Mr. Roberts's computer beeped. A message from Captain Miller appeared on the screen. The captain requested an immediate video call with the complaint office. When the captain's face appeared on the screen, he looked serious. "Mr. Roberts, I've just reviewed some disturbing evidence. Our AI system flagged suspicious patterns in Flight Attendant Reed's behavior. Dr. Thompson, I believe you and your son were unfairly denied boarding." Dr. Thompson nodded. "Yes, that's correct. And I noticed she allowed other passengers with identical documentation to board without any issues." "Our cameras caught that too," Captain Miller confirmed. "I've already contacted the company's ethics board. But there's something else you should know, Dr. Thompson. Our passenger manifest shows you're the leading expert in xenobiology who wrote the paper on cross-species emergency protocols." "Yes, that's me," she replied, wondering why that mattered now. The captain smiled. "Then you should know that your research is required reading for all our crew members, including Flight Attendant Reed, who clearly didn't recognize you." The irony would be funny if the situation weren't so serious. Marcus had been listening carefully, taking notes on his tablet just like before. "Mom," he said suddenly, "doesn't this mean she broke Rule 47 of the Galactic Transport Safety Code?" Everyone turned to look at him in surprise. "How do you know about Rule 47? Mr. Roberts asked. Marcus shrugged. "I read the whole safety code last month. Rule 47 says you can't deny boarding based on a passenger's species without proper documentation of a real security threat." Captain Miller chuckled. "Young man, you know our rules better than some of our staff." His expression turned serious again. "Dr. Thompson, I want to offer you and your son seats on tomorrow's flight, with a full upgrade to first class. But more importantly, I want you to know that this incident will be fully investigated." As they left the complaint office, Marcus felt a little better. He hadn't gotten to fly today, but at least the truth had come out. What he didn't know yet was that his knowledge of space travel and safety codes would soon prove far more valuable than anyone could have guessed. Above them, Flight 2184 continued its preparations for departure, while deep in its systems, another warning light began to blink, one that nobody had noticed yet. 3 hours into its journey, Flight 2184 cruised smoothly through the dark expanse of space. The massive ship carried over 200 passengers, most of them now either sleeping or watching entertainment on their personal screens. Jane Reed walked through the cabin, checking on passengers with the same practiced smile she always wore. Everything seemed normal until the first alarm went off. At first, it was just a quiet beeping from the ship's control panel. Captain Miller glanced at the warning light and frowned. The navigation system was showing strange readings. He tapped a few buttons, running a standard diagnostic check. "Arya," he called to the ship's AI, "what's causing these navigation irregularities?" Before Arya could answer, 3 more alarms started blaring. Red warning lights flashed across the control panel. The ship shuddered slightly, causing passengers to look up from their screens in concern. "Captain," Arya's usually calm voice sounded urgent, "primary navigation systems are failing. Backup systems not responding. We are detecting a large debris field ahead." Captain Miller's hands flew over the controls. "How long until impact?" "At current speed and trajectory, 28 minutes until we enter the debris field," Arya reported. The captain immediately pressed the crew alert button. "All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel to emergency stations." Jane Reed felt her heart race as she heard the alert. She rushed to her assigned emergency position, but her hands trembled as she tried to secure the safety equipment. She had never dealt with a real crisis before. Most of her time was spent handling what she considered problem passengers. In the control room, the situation was getting worse. The ship's engineers reported that the navigation system wasn't just malfunctioning, it was completely locked up. They couldn't change course, and the backup systems weren't responding to any commands. "Captain," one of the engineers said, his voice shaking, "I've never seen anything like this. It's like something is blocking all our override attempts." Captain Miller grabbed the ship-wide communication system. "Attention all passengers. This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions for safety procedures." The passengers stirred uneasily. A young Centaurian child started crying, its scales changing color from calm blue to frightened orange. The Proximan family huddled together in their environmental suits, whispering worriedly. Jane Reed stood in the aisle, trying to maintain order, but her usual confidence had vanished. "Everyone please stay in your seats," she announced, her voice cracking slightly. "Keep your safety harnesses fastened." Back in the control room, the situation grew more desperate with each passing minute. The engineers tried every standard emergency protocol in their manuals, but nothing worked. The ship continued its steady course toward the debris field, its navigation systems deaf to all commands. 17 minutes until impact, Arya announced calmly. Captain Miller wiped sweat from his forehead. "Send in emergency broadcast to all nearby stations," he ordered. "Full details of our situation. Request immediate assistance." The message went out, traveling faster than light through the emergency channels. But even if help was coming, would it arrive in time? In the passenger cabin, panic was starting to spread. The ship shuddered again, stronger this time. Overhead compartments popped open, spilling bags into the aisles. Reed stumbled, grabbing a seat to keep her balance. "What's happening?" Several passengers called out. "Are we going to crash?" Reed tried to remember her emergency training, but her mind went blank. All she could think about was how this might be her last flight, and how her last act had been to unfairly remove a passenger from the ship. 10 minutes until debris field contact, Arya announced over the speakers. The captain's voice came through again. All passengers move to emergency positions. Crew, begin evacuation pod preparation procedures. As chaos erupted in the cabin, no one noticed the message that flashed briefly on a maintenance screen near the back of the ship. It was a diagnostic report, showing a familiar pattern, one that a certain 12-year-old boy had spent months studying and would have recognized immediately. Back at the spaceport, Marcus sat in the waiting area with his mother, still disappointed about missing their flight. He was reading through the ship's technical manual on his tablet, not because he had to anymore, but because he loved learning about spacecraft. Dr. Thompson worked on her own tablet nearby, catching up on research papers. Suddenly, every screen in the spaceport terminal lit up with an emergency alert. Red letters flashed across the displays. Emergency broadcast Flight 2184 critical situation. Marcus's head snapped up. Mom, that's our flight. They rushed to the nearest information screen along with other travelers. The emergency message scrolled across. Flight 2184 experiencing complete navigation failure. Ship on collision course with debris field. Standard emergency protocols ineffective. Time to impact 8 minutes. Dr. Thompson's face went pale. She grabbed Marcus's hand and ran toward the Port Authority office. Come on. We need to help. Inside the office, controllers scrambled to respond to the crisis. Screens showed the ship's position and the approaching debris field. Radio chatter filled the room as they tried to coordinate with other nearby vessels for rescue operations. The closest rescue ship is 20 minutes away, one controller announced grimly. They'll never make it in time. Marcus stared at the technical readouts streaming across one of the screens. His eyes widened as he recognized a pattern in the error codes, the same one he'd studied just last week. Mom! He tugged at her sleeve. I know what's wrong with the ship. Not now, honey, Dr. Thompson said, trying to get the attention of a port official. But Mom, look! Marcus pointed at the screen. See those numbers? It's a cascade failure in the navigation computer. It happens when the system tries to calculate too many species-specific safety protocols at once. That got everyone's attention. The room fell silent as heads turned toward the 12-year-old boy. How do you know this? The lead controller asked, surprised. I studied it in the ship's manual, Marcus explained quickly. It happened to 3 other ships last year. The navigation computer gets confused trying to maintain different gravity and pressure settings for all the different species. It starts a feedback loop and locks up everything. Dr. Thompson's eyes lit up with understanding. He's right. And I know why the backup systems aren't working. They're probably trying to run the same protocols. The lead controller looked skeptical but desperate. Even if you're right, how does this help us? We can't reach the ship's main computer from here. Yes, we can, Marcus said excitedly. There's an emergency override channel. Chapter 7, page 243 of the manual. It's meant for exactly this kind of situation. The controller quickly pulled up the manual on his screen. His eyes widened as he found the passage Marcus mentioned. The boy's right. We can send a reset command through the emergency channel. Wait, Dr. Thompson interrupted. A full reset would affect life support too. With all those different species aboard. She paused, thinking hard. Marcus, remember when you showed me that trick about running systems in safe mode? Marcus nodded enthusiastically. The navigation computer can run on basic settings. It won't be comfortable for everyone, but it's better than crashing. The lead controller was already establishing the emergency connection. Flight 2184, this is Port Authority. We're attempting emergency override. Stand by. Marcus rattled off the specific commands needed while Dr. Thompson calculated the minimum safe settings for each species aboard. The controller's fingers flew over the keyboard, entering the commands. 5 minutes to debris field impact, came the response from the ship. Everyone held their breath as the override signal transmitted. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, "Port Authority, this is Flight 2184, Captain Miller's voice crackled through the speakers. Navigation systems responding. We have basic control restored. Beginning emergency maneuvers." A cheer went up in the control room. The tracking screen showed the ship slowly changing course, turning away from the debris field. Marcus grinned up at his mother, who hugged him tightly. Neither of them said anything about the irony that they were saving the very ship they'd been kicked off of. They were too busy being thankful everyone would be safe. But the day's excitement wasn't over yet. In fact, the most surprising part was still to come. Aboard Flight 2184, confusion turned to hope as the ship's systems began responding again. Captain Miller's hands steadied on the controls as he guided the massive vessel away from danger. On his screen, the threatening red dots of the debris field slowly moved from the center to the edge of the display. "All hands brace for emergency maneuvers," he announced over the ship's speakers. The vessel tilted as it changed course, causing loose items to slide across floors and tables. In the passenger cabin, Jane Reed gripped a handrail tightly. She watched as the Centaurian family's scales shifted from panic orange back to a calmer blue-green. The Proximan family huddled together in their environmental suits, whispering prayers of thanks in their native language. "Port Authority," Captain Miller called through the communication system, "whatever you did is working. But we're getting warning lights about the life support systems." Back in the control room at the spaceport, Marcus nodded as if he'd expected this. "That's because of the safe mode," he explained to the controllers. "The ship thinks it's making a mistake because the settings are different from normal." Dr. Thompson stepped forward. "Captain, this is Dr. Thompson. We had to simplify the life support settings to get the navigation working again. You'll need to make some quick adjustments for your different species aboard." She began listing off specific instructions. "For the Centaurians, maintain humidity at 60%. It's lower than usual, but their scales can handle it. The Proximans are safe in their suits, so their section can run at human normal settings. The Europans will need," she continued, drawing from her years of xenobiology research. The captain relayed these instructions to his crew. Throughout the ship, environmental controls shifted and adjusted. Some passengers felt slightly uncomfortable, but compared to the disaster they just avoided, no one complained. 2 minutes until we're clear of the debris field," Arya announced. In the spaceport control room, Marcus watched the ship's progress on the main screen. His heart raced with excitement as the distance between the ship and the dangerous debris grew larger. He had spent so many hours studying these systems, dreaming of space travel, and now that knowledge was actually saving lives. "Port Authority," Captain Miller's voice came through. "Again, we're almost clear. But I need to know who figured out what was wrong with our systems. Our own engineers couldn't solve it." The lead controller smiled, putting his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Sir, you can thank Marcus Thompson, the young man your flight attendant removed from the flight this morning. He recognized a pattern in your system failure." There was a long pause from the ship's end. When the captain spoke again, his voice carried a mix of amazement and irony. "The boy we didn't let board saved us all? Don't forget Dr. Thompson," the controller added. Her knowledge of species-specific environmental needs kept everyone safe during the emergency adjustments. On the ship, Jane Reed's face had turned pale. She remembered how she had treated them just hours ago, making up false excuses to keep them off the flight. Now, she realized that her prejudiced actions could have led to disaster if they had been on board. They might not have been able to help from the spaceport. "Debris field cleared," Arya announced. "Ship stability at 98%. All systems functioning within safe parameters." A cheer went up in both the ship and the control room. Passengers hugged each other, regardless of species. The crisis had brought out the best in everyone. Well, almost everyone. Captain Miller's voice came through one more time. "Dr. Thompson, Marcus. On behalf of everyone aboard Flight 2184, thank you. We owe you our lives. Marcus beamed with pride, but he wasn't thinking about revenge or showing up those who had wronged him. He was just happy he could help. His mother hugged him close, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." The emergency was over, but the story was far from finished. In fact, what happened next would change not just Marcus's life, but the way the entire spaceship company operated. News of Flight 2184's near disaster spread quickly through the galaxy's communication networks. By the time the ship safely landed at its destination 6 hours later, the story was already making headlines. 12-year-old Earth boy saves spacecraft after being denied boarding. Video feeds showed passengers hugging their families at the arrival gate, many of them stopping to speak with news reporters about their experience. The Centaurian family's scales flickered with excitement as they described how the ship had nearly crashed into the debris field. The Proximan father held his children close as he told reporters how grateful he was to the young human who saved them. Back at the spaceport, Marcus and his mother found themselves surrounded by journalists. Camera drones hovered nearby, broadcasting their interviews across multiple star systems. "I just remembered what I read in the manual," Marcus explained simply, slightly overwhelmed by all the attention. "Anyone could have figured it out if they studied the systems like I did." Dr. Thompson watched her son with pride, but her expression turned serious when reporters asked about why they weren't on the flight. "We were removed from the flight due to alleged documentation errors," she said carefully. "However, our tickets and papers were completely valid." The story took an even more interesting turn when the ship's AI, Aria, released its complete logs of the boarding incident. The records clearly showed Flight Attendant Reed's pattern of discrimination, including footage of her allowing other passengers with identical documentation to board while rejecting Marcus and his mother. In the Galactic Transit Line's headquarters, executives held an emergency meeting. The company's reputation was at stake. Not only had they nearly lost a ship due to a technical failure, but the circumstances surrounding Marcus's removal from the flight painted them in a terrible light. "The boy's knowledge of our systems saved hundreds of lives," the company president said, reviewing the reports. "And we almost denied him passage because of..." "What? The color of his skin? This is unacceptable." The investigation into Jane Reed's actions revealed more troubling patterns. Records showed she had denied boarding to other human passengers over the past year, always citing vague system errors that couldn't be verified. Captain Miller testified about the incident via holographic link. "If Dr. Thompson and her son had been aboard," he explained, "we might not have received the help we needed in time. But that's no excuse for what happened. We're supposed to be better than this." The Galactic Transport Safety Board launched their own investigation. They were particularly interested in Marcus's identification of the cascade failure pattern. 3 similar incidents had occurred on other ships in the past year, but no one had connected the dots until now. Marcus found himself invited to speak with the Safety Board's technical committee. He sat at a large table, surrounded by experts from different species, explaining how he had recognized the problem. "The pattern was there in the manual," he told them, pointing to specific passages on his tablet. "When ships try to maintain too many different environmental settings at once, the computer gets overloaded. It's like trying to make everyone happy at the same time and getting stuck." One of the board members, a senior engineer, looked impressed. "You've identified a serious flaw in our systems. One that we should have caught long ago." Meanwhile, Jane Reed faced a disciplinary hearing. She sat alone in a small office, watching recordings of her own actions during boarding. The contrast between her treatment of different passengers was impossible to deny. I didn't realize how obvious it was," she said quietly, watching herself turn away the Thompsons while welcoming others with identical documentation. But the biggest surprise came at the end of the day, when Galactic Transit Lines made an announcement that would change everything. The company's president stepped up to a podium, cameras broadcasting his speech across the galaxy. "Today, We announce a complete overhaul of our policies and procedures, he began. And to help us build a better, more inclusive future in space travel, we've created a new advisory position. We'd like to offer this role to someone who has already proven his understanding of our systems and his commitment to the safety of all passengers, regardless of their species. Marcus, watching the announcement at home with his mother, had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. 2 weeks after the Flight 2184 incident, Marcus stood in front of a large window at Galactic Transit Line's headquarters, watching ships take off and land. He wore a new blue uniform, specially made for his role as Junior Safety Advisor. The badge on his chest sparkled under the morning sunlight. The door behind him opened, and he turned to see Jane Reed enter the room. She looked different now. Her perfect hairstyle was simpler, and her eyes carried a weight they hadn't before. This was their first meeting since the incident. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly. I wanted to speak with you before I start my retraining." After the investigation, the company had given Reed a choice: permanent dismissal or complete retraining with a focus on anti-discrimination and cultural awareness. She had chosen the latter, surprising many who thought she would quit. Marcus nodded, remembering what his mother had told him: sometimes people need a chance to learn from their mistakes. "I was wrong," Reed continued, her voice shaking slightly. "Not just about you and your mother, but about everything. I've spent the past 2 weeks reviewing all my decisions, all the times I used system errors as an excuse. I never thought about how much danger I put everyone in by letting my prejudices affect my job." A group of trainee flight attendants passed by the window, their group notably more diverse than before. The company had implemented Marcus's suggestion to actively recruit staff from all species and backgrounds. "The new training program starts today," Reed explained. "Dr. Thompson, your mother, she's one of the instructors. She'll be teaching us about different species' needs and cultural considerations." She paused. "I understand if you can't forgive me, but I wanted you to know I'm trying to change." Marcus thought for a moment before responding. "You know what I learned from studying all those ship manuals? Every species brings something different that makes space travel better. The Proximans invented the best radiation shielding. The Centaurians created the most efficient life support systems. Humans developed the navigation computers. We need everybody." Down in the training center, Dr. Thompson was preparing for her first class. The room was filled with both new recruits and existing staff members. On the screens around her, the new company policies scrolled past: all passengers deserve equal treatment regardless of species or origin. Safety protocols must consider the needs of all travelers. When in doubt, ask for help. Diversity is our strength. In another part of the building, engineers were implementing the Thompson protocol named after Marcus's discovery. The new system prevented navigation computer overload by better managing environmental controls. They had already installed it on 50 ships, with plans to upgrade the entire fleet. Captain Miller, who had become one of Marcus's strongest supporters, often invited him to speak to ship crews about safety procedures. "The boy has a way of making complex systems simple to understand," he would say. "And more importantly, he reminds us why we're out here in the first place, to bring everyone together among the stars." The changes weren't limited to just one company. Other space lines began adopting similar policies and technical improvements. The Galactic Transport Safety Board made Marcus's safety observations part of their standard training materials. As Marcus walked through the headquarters that day, he saw the results of his influence everywhere. Mixed species crews worked together at control stations. Training rooms were filled with diverse groups learning from each other. Even the ship designs were changing, with new models featuring improved environmental systems that could handle multiple species' needs more efficiently. Reed watched him for a moment longer before heading to her first training session. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me a better way." Marcus smiled as she left. He turned back to the window, watching another ship take off into the bright sky. This one carried a new crew, trained under the new policies, ready to make space travel safer and more welcoming for everyone. The changes weren't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But as Marcus looked down at his advisory badge, he knew that every small step forward mattered. The future of space travel was becoming more inclusive, one flight at a time. 1 year after the Flight 2184 incident, Marcus stood at Gate B7 of the New Earth spaceport once again. This time, he wasn't just a passenger, he wore the silver and blue uniform of a senior junior safety advisor, with several achievement pins sparkling on his chest. The terminal looked different now. Digital screens displayed welcome messages in multiple languages. Information kiosks offered help in every known species' native tongue. Most notably, the staff included members of every spacefaring race, all working together smoothly. "Ready for the anniversary ceremony?" Dr. Thompson asked, approaching with a smile. She now served as the head of interspecies relations for Galactic Transit Lines, a position created specifically for her expertise. Marcus nodded, checking his tablet one last time. In the past year, his safety recommendations had been implemented on over 5,000 ships. Not a single navigation cascade failure had occurred since the new Thompson Protocol went into effect. The ceremony was being held in the main terminal, where Flight 2184's story had begun. The massive space was packed with beings from across the galaxy: passengers, crew members, reporters, and officials. At the center stood the newly designed Universal Welcome Desk, built to accommodate travelers of all shapes and sizes. Captain Miller stepped up to the podium first. His uniform now carried the rank of Fleet Commander, but he still personally flew routes twice a month to stay connected with the real work, as he put it. 1 year ago, he began, a series of events showed us both the worst and the best of what we can be. Today, we celebrate not just the changes we've made, but the lives that have been improved because of them. The screens behind him displayed statistics: passenger satisfaction up 47%. Safety incidents down 89%. Staff diversity increased by 312%. Employee retention at an all-time high. Jane Reed took the stage next. She had completed her retraining and now served as the lead instructor for the company's Cultural Awareness program. Her previous actions weren't forgotten, but she had worked hard to become part of the solution. "I stand here as proof that people can change," she said, her voice clear and confident. "That we can learn to see beyond our prejudices and recognize the value in every being we meet." The ceremony's surprise came when the Galactic Transport Safety Board announced the creation of the Marcus Thompson Scholarship. Every year, young beings from all species would receive funding to study space transport systems and safety protocols. The next generation of space travelers should never face discrimination, the board chairman declared. And thanks to young Marcus's actions, they'll have more opportunities than ever to reach for the stars. Marcus himself gave a short speech, still somewhat shy despite his year in the spotlight. "I just wanted to learn about spaceships," he said, making the crowd laugh. "But what I really learned was that space is big enough for everyone. We're all different, and that's what makes space travel amazing." As the ceremony ended, Marcus watched Flight 2184's successor prepare for takeoff through the terminal windows. The new ship gleamed in the sunlight, its hull bearing the inscription, "Together among the stars." The flight crew was a perfect example of the new way of doing things: a Proxima captain, a Centaurian first officer, a human navigator, and a mixed species crew. They moved through their pre-flight checks with practiced ease, each bringing their unique strengths to the task. "Time for your shift?" Dr. Thompson asked, seeing Marcus check his watch. He nodded. At 13, he was the youngest safety advisor in the company's history, but no one questioned his authority anymore. His knowledge and dedication had earned everyone's respect. "You know," he said, walking toward his station, "sometimes I think about that day when we were turned away from the flight. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here making things better." his mother finished. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. As Marcus began his safety rounds, he passed the spot where he had once stood with his mother, facing discrimination. Now, it was a place where all species gathered freely, where differences were celebrated rather than feared. The story of Flight 2184 was now taught in every space academy as a turning point in galactic travel history. But for Marcus, it was simply the beginning of his real adventure, helping to build a future where everyone could reach for the stars together.